Hello, my name is Alex Graves, and today I'll be talking about Our Final Warning 6 Degrees of Climate Emergency by Mark Lynas. In 2007, Mark had originally published a book called 6 Degrees. It was a breakdown of what changes to the Earth's climate and geophysical characteristics that we can expect for each degree of warming from 1 to 6 degrees. It was innovative in how it framed the crisis, and each chapter in the book addressed another degree of warming and included detailed descriptions of how that much atmospheric carbon would impact climate, oceans, temperature, glaciers, and all life on Earth. This novel, or that book rather, expertly escalated the dread, despair, and nightmarish conditions of an increasingly warm world. It had a massive impact, and nearly a decade and a half later, Mark decided that it would be a good idea to rewrite and update the book. He states that the science hasn't radically changed since 2007 when the original book was published. He even goes on to say that it hasn't changed since the late 19th century. Rather, the modeling systems are better now, and our projections are hopefully more accurate, but the science hasn't honestly changed. The reason that he wanted to update this book was because of a specific pulling out of a carbon accord, I guess, with some foreign countries about carbon emissions that President Trump pulled out of during his term as president. For someone not well versed in like environmental science or even just science in general, this book is this book, Our Final Warning, holds immense value. The Mark pored over studies, he looked at models, projections, he read papers, wrote papers, did his own specific research even to make this information accessible and effective for people who don't necessarily know what all of it means. If current climate science has not expressed sufficient certainty over a possible outcome, it's not in this book. It doesn't give in to dramatics, it refrains from excessive speculation. Rather, it talks about what he calls the, quote, known knowns, rather than the unknowable possible futures of climate change that can inspire somewhat sensationalist emotions. This is why the 6th degree chapter in the book is approximately half the length to the 2nd degree chapter. The author acknowledges in the book that if we're unfortunate enough to hit those 5 or 6 degree markers, the world will be so incredibly different that modern science can scarcely imagine it. Such a future is thankfully unrealistic right now, as world leaders are finally beginning to acknowledge the urgency of the situation. But as of 2021, we are still probably on track for warming to hit somewhere between 2 and 3 degrees of temperature rise. This in and of itself will still be disastrous, and modern science is able to tell us with impressive accuracy just how bad it could get, and Lynas does an excellent job of summarizing what these futures will look like if we do not get our act together soon. Our Final Warning, despite being written during a more pessimistic and annoyingly slow era of climate action, is far from being nihilistic. It spreads itself over 6 terrifying degrees of mounting terror, but peppered in throughout the book are enough nuggets of hope and belief in humanity that we might be able to figure out a way out of this mess. Something specific to me that I noticed was that he was able to present this in a way that made me understand it without having to break my brain about how the science works or how any of this actually all makes sense. He presents all of these papers and he references everything quite well. However, there is a few times where I was kind of thinking to myself, like, okay, I don't really understand this. So I did have to do some external research on a few topics, but not many. Rather, this was quite, like I stated before, it was quite extensive in its explanation, even to people who don't necessarily know the science behind some of this stuff, which is me. I mean, I don't pretend to understand climate science, and I don't think I ever will pretend to understand climate science. But this is something that I was interested in, and something that I decided that I wanted to learn more about. Specifically, after hearing rave reviews about the original book that he published, I was even more excited to read his second iteration of it. Something that I also found interesting about this book was that with each chapter was each degree of global warming. So for 1 through 6 essentially, and I stated this earlier too, but it was easy to read because honestly you could kind of stop and check yourself as you were doing your own research on some of the things that he was talking about, and him being the author, of course, that Mark Lynas was talking about in this novel, or in this book. The degrees are easy to understand. They're very clear about describing what things happen when, and when to expect certain things to happen to our global climate. It's really terrifying, especially for someone like me who doesn't understand the science, and I don't know if I ever will understand the science, but it was terrifying to me just to listen to what he was proposing would happen. And basically, he didn't even propose it. It was this is going to happen, whether you like it or not, and you need to figure it out, or it's going to get ugly really fast. And so something that this book really inspired me to want to be better about my own carbon footprint, about what I can do to reduce my own effects on climate carbon and carbon emissions. All of these things are what is going to lead to the eventual climate change that is currently happening and will continue to happen. Reading a book detailing the disastrous scientific effects of climate change could easily be like boring and sad and depressing. This is not that kind of book. Anyone who wants to read this book and feel hopeless, they're misinterpreting its message. There's always work to be done. He points out in the book 1.5 degrees of temperature rise is better than 2, which is better than 2.5, which is better than 3 degrees. We can never stop, because every second we spend rebelling against the dark future has the potential to make it just a little bit brighter. All in all, this book was really well written. It was voiced really well by Mark. And I apologize, I'm getting over a cold. This book, though, is a legitimate call to action, whatever that might mean to you. And for me, it was figuring out things that I can do to reduce my own carbon footprint. Maybe it's voting for, environmentally progressive political candidates, supporting organizations dedicated to tackling and addressing climate change. Whatever it is, any call to action needs a common goal. And this book paints a picture of catastrophic future we need to rebel against. If we do that collectively, we hopefully nothing described in this book will ever come to pass. So overall, this was a really well written book, and I really hope that somebody else out there reads it and enjoys it in the same way that I did.